Smoke and spark summer had finally arrived, and with it came the long evenings that begged for the smell of charcoal, the sizzle of meat, and the laughter of neighbors gathered in backyards. For me, it was a tradition. Every Saturday, I would fire up my grill, marinate some ribs or chicken, and invite a few friends over. It wasn't anything wild, just casual gatherings that kept spirits high and built a sense of community. But traditions, as I would soon discover, were fragile things in a neighborhood run by people who thrived on control. The first few weekends had gone by without incident. My closest neighbors, the Johnsons and the Parkers, loved coming over. Their kids would run around with my niece, tossing water balloons while we adults shared drinks and food. The laughter would rise into the warm evening air, blending with the sound of cicadas. It was peaceful, comforting, and exactly the kind of suburban life I had imagined when I bought my house. But across the street lived her, the woman who had already gained a reputation for nitpicking every minor detail in the neighborhood. People called her Karen, not her real name, but one that fit her perfectly. She was the type of person who thought she was the unofficial sheriff of the block. Always watching, always judging, and always reporting. She thrived on rules, complaints, and control. The first time she noticed my BBQ was a warm Saturday evening in early June. She stood on her porch, hands on her hips, glaring as smoke drifted from my backyard. At first I brushed it off. Maybe she was just annoyed by the smell or the noise of kids playing. But I didn't think too much of it. That changed the second weekend. As my friends and I enjoyed grilled steaks and a cold beer, a police cruiser rolled slowly up to the curb. The flashing lights caught everyone's attention, and conversations quieted. I walked to the front yard, confused, only to see Karen standing triumphantly on her porch. Her arms crossed and a smug smile plastered across her face. The officers were polite but firm. They had received a noise complaint and a report of excessive smoke. I looked around at my gathering. The kids were giggling by the sprinkler. The adults were chatting quietly. Music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker. It was hardly a rager. Still, I had to comply. I turned down the music and doused part of the grill. The officers, clearly unimpressed with Karen's complaint, left quickly, but the damage was done. The mood had shifted. That night, the gathering ended earlier than usual. My friends left with awkward glances, whispering about Karen's behavior. I went to bed with a mix of anger and disbelief. Who calls the cops over a simple backyard BBQ? The next week, I tried to keep things quieter. Smaller group, less music, fewer kids. Still, Karen found something to complain about. Another police visit. This time she claimed I was violating fire safety by grilling too close to my fence. The officer sighed as he checked the setup. It was perfectly safe and legal. Again, nothing came of it, but the embarrassment was growing. Neighbors were noticing, and Karen was relishing every second of her self-appointed victory. By the fourth weekend, I had had enough. I wasn't breaking any laws. My grill was safe. My parties were peaceful, and the noise barely registered above normal neighborhood life. Yet here she was, determined to ruin every moment of joy I created. That night, as I sat alone in my backyard staring at the cold grill, an idea began to form. Karen wanted to shut me down. She wanted me isolated, humiliated, and controlled. But what if, instead of shrinking away, I did the opposite? What if I made my BBQs so big, so undeniably festive, and so widely attended that she couldn't possibly shut them down without making herself the enemy of the entire neighborhood? The thought made me smile for the first time in weeks. If Karen wanted war, I would give her one. But it wouldn't be through shouting matches or petty complaints. No, my revenge would come in the form of community, joy, and an overwhelming wave of support that she couldn't possibly counter, I began planning. I reached out to neighbors, not just the close friends I usually invited, but families all around the block. Some were hesitant at first, worried about HOA rules or Karen's temper. But when I explained how she had repeatedly called the police over nothing, most were eager to join. No one liked her constant nagging. Many had their own stories of her meddling. By the end of the week, I had commitments from over a dozen households. We would host a neighborhood BBQ like no other. A block party, really, but held right in my backyard. Food, drinks, games, music, the works. If Karen wanted to play the role of villain, we would make sure she had an audience for her performance. The day of the big BBQ arrived, and I was ready. Tables lined the yard, loaded with food brought by neighbors. Someone set up a cornhole game, another brought a bounce house for the kids, and music flowed from a carefully arranged set of speakers that complied with city noise ordinances. It was festive, warm, and filled with laughter, and right on cue. Karen appeared. She stood at the edge of her property, her face red with rage as she saw nearly the entire neighborhood gathered in my yard. Her phone was in her hand, and I knew what was coming. But this time I didn't flinch. This time I was ready for her. When the police car eventually rolled down the street again, they found not a rowdy disturbance, but a full-fledged community gathering. Parents, kids, seniors, everyone chatting, eating, and playing. The officer looked around, clearly recognizing the absurdity of the call. Karen tried to argue, pointing furiously toward the grill and the crowd, but the officer shook his head and moved on. The look on her face as the party continued without interruption was priceless. Her power was crumbling, and for the first time, I felt like I had taken control back, but this was only the beginning. Because what started as a simple act of defiance soon grew into something much larger, a battle between one woman's obsession with control and an entire community's right to enjoy life. And I was determined to win. The neighborhood unites. The morning after the block-wide barbecue, the neighborhood was buzzing in a way it hadn't in years. People waved at each other with fresh warmth. Kids compared stories about the bounce house, and even the older couples, who usually kept to themselves, spoke with excitement about how much fun they'd had. For once, it felt like we weren't just people living on the same street, we were a community, but not everyone shared that sentiment. Karen had spent the entire evening of the BBQ storming around her property like a guard dog on patrol, calling the cops more than once and glaring at every single neighbor who dared to smile. Though her attempts failed, the embarrassment had only hardened her resolve. By the next morning, it was clear she wasn't going to drop it. She started with passive-aggressive gestures. A long, angry email was blasted through the neighborhood group chat one. She had insisted on moderating when it was created years ago. In it, she complained about excessive noise, illegal gatherings, and smoke hazards. She warned us all about potential fines and claimed the HOA would be looking into disciplinary measures. Most neighbors rolled their eyes, but some newer families, unfamiliar with her tactics, began to worry. I knew what she was doing. This wasn't about safety or rules, it was about control. If she couldn't ruin my BBQs directly, she would try to manipulate others into turning against me. It was her way of reminding everyone that she still had power. So I did the opposite. I doubled down on the sense of unity. That week I walked door to door talking with neighbors. Not about Karen directly, though everyone brought her up anyway, but about keeping the good energy going. I suggested a rotating community BBQ where different households could host every few weeks. Instead of my house being the target, we would spread the gatherings around the block. To my surprise, people loved the idea. They were tired of Karen's constant meddling, and the thought of standing together gave them courage. Families who had barely spoken before now exchanged recipes, planned activities, and offered to bring chairs, coolers, and grills. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood from one person's stranglehold. The following Saturday, the Johnsons hosted the second BBQ. Their backyard was even bigger than mine, and the turnout was massive. More neighbors showed up this time, encouraged by the first event. Kids rode bikes up and down the street while parents mingled, enjoying cold drinks. The atmosphere was light, almost rebellious, like everyone knew they were part of something bigger than a simple party. And once again, Karen appeared. This time she didn't just glare from her porch. She marched right into the Johnsons' yard, waving her phone like a weapon. Though she couldn't raise her voice above the music and laughter, she still tried, pointing toward the grill, accusing the host of violating HOA bylaws and threatening to report every single one of us. But something had changed. The Johnsons, backed by dozens of neighbors, didn't shrink away. They smiled, they shrugged, and they continued their conversations as if she wasn't there. Some even laughed outright at her outbursts. For the first time, Karen wasn't feared. She was mocked. When the police car showed up again, the same officer from the previous week stepped out. You could see the weariness on his face, the frustration of being called to deal with what was clearly nothing more than a neighborhood spat. He barely glanced at the party before walking over to Karen, speaking in a tone too low for us to hear. But whatever he said, it silenced her. She stormed back across the street, slamming her door so hard it echoed. The officer gave us a small shake of the head, almost apologetic, before driving away. The party roared back to life, louder than before. Karen had lost again, but we all knew she wasn't done. The next morning, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Not a standard HO and notice it, was a personal letter typed out in bold, threatening language. Karen accused me of organizing illegal block parties, of disturbing the peace, and of creating hazardous conditions. She claimed she would ensure disciplinary action through the HOA, the city, and even the fire marshal if necessary. At first I laughed. It was so over the top that it felt absurd. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized her next move wouldn't be just angry emails or police calls. She was going to drag the HOA into this. And if she managed to twist the board into siding with her, the neighborhood unity we had built could crumble under the weight of fines, rules, and bureaucracy. That week, the whispers began. Neighbors who worked with Karen on HOA committees mentioned she was lobbying for special rules to regulate outdoor gatherings, grills, and noise. She was pushing for restrictions that would target not just me, but anyone who dared to host similar events. It was a classic tactic. If she couldn't win against me directly, she would change the rules of the game. But Karen had underestimated just how fed up people were with her antics. Instead of cowering, the neighborhood grew bolder. The Parkers volunteered to host the next BBQ, and before long, plans were forming for something even bigger, a community potluck that would take over the entire cul-de-sac. Neighbors who had never attended HOA meetings before began talking about showing up to vote against Karen's proposals. It wasn't just about BBQs anymore. It had become a fight for freedom to enjoy our homes, our families, and our lives without constant surveillance and interference. By the time the third Saturday rolled around, the neighborhood was united like never before. Dozens of people gathered, tables stretched across driveways, and food overflowed from every grill and oven. It was loud, yes, but not rowdy. It was joyful, inclusive, and undeniable proof that Karen's grip was slipping. Of course, she didn't take it well. She emerged again, red-faced and shouting, phone in hand. But this time, something extraordinary happened. Instead of ignoring her, neighbors began recording her. Cameras and phones pointed in her direction as she ranted, documenting every word, every wild accusation, every furious gesture. Karen froze. She wasn't used to being on the defensive. For years, she had been the one in control, the one filing complaints and threatening fines. Now she was the spectacle, the one being exposed for her behavior. She turned and fled inside, slamming her door yet again. The videos spread quickly through the neighborhood chat, laughter filling the comments. For once, she wasn't feared. She was pitied, ridiculed, and increasingly irrelevant, but I knew it was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to retreat permanently. She would regroup, she would plan, and she would come back harder than before. And I was right, because within days, official HOA letters began appearing in mailboxes. Letters warning of excessive gatherings, noise complaints, and potential fire hazards. Letters that carried the weight of the board behind them. Karen had finally dragged the HOA into the war. And that meant the battle was only just beginning. The HOA strikes back. The HOA letters arrived in crisp white envelopes, stamped with the association's official seal. For years, most residents barely glanced at those envelopes, tossing them aside after skimming the usual reminders about landscaping or dues. But this time, the tone was different. The words were sharp, the language threatening, and the message unmistakable. The board was now involved. The notice accused residents of hosting unauthorized mass gatherings and warned that repeated violations could result in fines, legal action, or even liens placed on properties. It cited vague bylaws about nuisance activity and safety hazards, clearly twisted to target the growing neighborhood BBQs. There was no question who was behind it. Karen's fingerprints were all over the language, overblown, exaggerated, dripping with superiority. She had finally managed to weaponize the HOA against us. At first, the neighborhood buzzed with unease. People had joined the block parties to push back against Karen's meddling. But now, with the HOA threatening real consequences, some started to waver. Families who had once laughed at her rants began worrying about fines they couldn't afford. Others dreaded the thought of drawn-out disputes with the board. I couldn't blame them. For many, homeownership was already stressful enough without the added burden of constant battles. But I also knew that if we gave in now, Karen would win not just against me, but against everyone. The neighborhood would slip back into silence, and her reign of control would be complete. So I made a decision. If Karen wanted to fight through the HOA, we would fight back the same way, by using the rules, the laws, and the system itself against her. The first step was research. I spent hours digging through the HOA bylaws, combing through every clause and regulation. What I found was revealing. The rules about nuisance gatherings were vague at best, and there were no specific restrictions on outdoor cooking, parties, or community events unless they caused demonstrable harm. That wording left plenty of room for interpretation and plenty of opportunities to push back. Next, I reached out to a neighbor who happened to be an attorney. He had attended the BBQs with his family and was just as fed up with Karen as the rest of us. When I showed him the HOA letter, he shook his head in disbelief. He explained that while HOAs have power, they aren't above the law. Many of their rules can't override local or state protections, especially when it comes to lawful use of private property. That was the key. Karen was relying on fear and intimidation, hoping the threat of fines would be enough to scare people into submission. But if we stood firm, armed with facts and support, we could beat her at her own game. Word spread quickly. Soon, neighbors were meeting not just for BBQs, but for strategy sessions. We compared letters, drafted responses, and shared legal resources. For the first time, the HOA itself was under scrutiny. Its vague bylaws and questionable enforcement practices laid bare for everyone to see. Karen, of course, didn't sit quietly. She doubled down, lobbying the board to hold an emergency meeting to discuss disciplinary measures. Flyers appeared on doors, urging residents to restore order and protect property values. It was laughable our block had never been more lively, more connected, or more united. If anything, property values were likely going up because of the sense of community. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in control. When the night of the HOA meeting arrived, the community center was packed. Normally, these meetings drew a handful of board attendees, but this time, nearly every family showed up. People came armed with questions, complaints, and frustration that had been simmering for years. Karen sat in the front row, her posture stiff, her expression smug. She was in her element. This was the battlefield she had chosen. And she believed she would crush us with procedure and bureaucracy, but she hadn't counted on the turnout. One by one, neighbors stood to speak. They described the joy of the BBQs, the friendships that had blossomed, and the harmless nature of the gatherings. They pointed out the absurdity of police being called for nothing more than laughter and grilled food. Some even shared stories of Karen's harassment, her constant complaints, her habit of monitoring everyone's yards, her confrontations with delivery drivers and visitors. The attorney neighbor presented the legal side, calmly explaining that the HOAS letters had no enforceable basis under local law. He cited statutes protecting homeowners' rights, pointing out that the board risked overstepping its authority if it pursued fines. As the testimonies piled up, the mood shifted. The board members, initially stern and cautious, began to look uneasy. It was clear they hadn't expected this level of resistance or this level of unity. They had assumed they could send a few threatening letters and the problem would resolve itself. Instead, they were facing an entire neighborhood rallying against one person's vendetta. Karen, sensing her grip slipping, tried to seize control. She launched into a tirade about rowdy behavior, public safety, and declining standards. But instead of nods of agreement, she was met with eye rolls, laughter, and even boos. Her authority, once propped up by fear and intimidation, was crumbling under the weight of collective defiance. By the end of the meeting, the board was forced to backpedal. They announced that no fines would be issued at this time and that the rules would be reviewed before any further action. It was a thinly veiled retreat, but a retreat nonetheless. Karen stormed out before the meeting even ended, her face pale with fury. The victory felt sweet, but I knew it was temporary. Karen wasn't the type to give up. She had failed with the police. She had failed with the HOA, but she wasn't finished. If anything, she was more dangerous than ever, because now her pride was on the line. The very next week, she proved me right. A bright orange notice appeared on my door, stamped by the city. It claimed there had been a report of improper outdoor cooking equipment and that an inspection was scheduled. Karen had escalated again, this time beyond the HOA, dragging city officials into her crusade, and once more, I realized the battle was only getting bigger. Smoke and mirrors. The orange notice on my front door was the kind of thing designed to send a homeowner's stomach into freefall. Bright, bold, and official-looking. It announced that my property had been reported for improper outdoor cooking equipment. An inspection was scheduled within the week, and failure to comply could result in fines or forced removal of the grill. I didn't need a detective to know who was behind it. Karen had failed to shut us down through the police. She had failed to weaponize the HOA. Now she had escalated the battle to the city itself. It was a clever move in some ways. Government bureaucracy has a way of intimidating people even more than HOA letters, but it was also reckless. Because if the city found her complaints baseless, she wouldn't just look like a nuisance. She would look like a liar. The notice became the talk of the neighborhood. People stopped by, shaking their heads, offering support, and sharing their own stories of Karen's pettiness. It wasn't just me anymore. She had reported people for leaving garbage cans out too long, for planting flowers too close to the curb, for parking in what she claimed were her spots. The BBQ feud had simply made her vendetta more visible. Still, the idea of a city inspection filled me with anxiety. What if they found something wrong? What if some obscure regulation gave her exactly what she wanted? I spent hours checking my grill setup, measuring the distance from the fence, verifying the propane connections, even researching local codes on outdoor cooking. Everything was compliant. But I knew that with Karen watching, one small oversight could become ammunition. The day of the inspection arrived hot and humid. A city inspector in a crisp uniform pulled up in a white truck, clipboard in hand. Right on cue, Karen emerged from her porch, pretending to water her flowers while she hovered close enough to watch every move. The inspector was professional, thorough, and polite. He measured, he checked, he asked a few questions. I explained that the grill was standard, purchased from a major retailer, and had been in use for years without incident. He nodded, jotting notes, clearly unimpressed with the gravity of the complaint. After 20 minutes, he closed his clipboard and gave me a small smile. Everything was in order. No violations, no fines. Case closed. Karen's face, as she overheard, was priceless. She froze, hose in hand, water spilling onto the pavement as the inspector climbed into his truck and drove away. For once, she had no words. Her weapon had backfired, but instead of feeling relief, I felt something stronger, momentum. Karen had crossed a line, and every failed attempt made her weaker. She wanted to isolate me, to intimidate me into silence. But the more she fought, the more the neighborhood rallied. It was time to turn defense into offense. That week, I proposed an idea in the neighborhood chat, a full-scale block party. Not just a BBQ in one backyard, but a coordinated event that would bring the entire street together. We'd apply for the proper permits, close off the road, and make it official. With food, games, music, and decorations. It would be undeniable proof that Karen's complaints didn't represent the community. The response was overwhelming. People volunteered to bring tables, speakers, tents, and coolers. Someone suggested a dunk tank for the kids. Another family offered to hire a food truck as backup. What had started as a small act of rebellion had become a full-fledged movement. As planning kicked off, Karen made her presence felt again. She bombarded the group chat with furious messages about unauthorized use of public space, traffic hazards, and illegal gatherings. She threatened to call not just the HOA or the police, but the fire department and even the health department. Every message was met with silence or, worse for her, with emojis and jokes. Her power to intimidate had evaporated. When the day of the block party arrived, it felt like a festival. The street was closed, tables stretched from one end to the other, and the smell of grilled food hung in the air. Music played, kids darted between games, and neighbors mingled freely. Even families who had once stayed distant came out, drawn by the energy of unity. Karen, of course, was livid. She paced the edge of her property like a sentry, phone clutched in her hand, her face twisted with fury. True to form, she called the police. And once again, the same weary officer arrived. This time greeted not by a suspicious backyard gathering, but by a full-fledged permitted event. He checked the paperwork, confirmed everything was legal, and even accepted a plate of ribs from one of the neighbors. His smile said it all. This was no violation. This was community. Karen's rage boiled over. She screamed from her porch, accusing the entire block of harassment, of conspiring against her, of creating unlivable conditions. Phones came out again, recording every word. Within hours, her meltdown was circulating in the neighborhood chat, then on social media. She had become a caricature, the neighborhood villain whose tantrums only made her more isolated, but even as we celebrated, I knew better than to think she was finished. People like Karen don't surrender. They don't admit defeat. They retreat. They regroup, and they strike again from another angle. And sure enough, within days, a new notice arrived. Not from the city this time, but from the HOA. The board, pressured by Karen, announced they were considering new bylaws, ones that would explicitly restrict outdoor cooking, limit gatherings, and impose stricter noise rules. It was a direct attack. Karen had failed to enforce the rules as they stood, so now she was trying to rewrite them. And if she succeeded, it wouldn't matter how united we were, the bylaws would give her the power she craved. The neighborhood had won every battle so far, but the war was entering a new phase. This wasn't just about BBQs anymore. It was about freedom, property rights, and the very character of the community, and I was ready to fight harder than ever. The bylaw battle, the announcement hit like a thunderclap. The HOA board was considering new bylaws to regulate outdoor gatherings, noise, and cooking. The notice was short but decisive. It explained that, in response to community concerns, the board would vote on whether to restrict BBQs, parties, and outdoor events. The wording was clearly Karen's. Community concerns was her code. For my complaints, this was her last desperate gambit. If she couldn't twist the old rules against us, she would create new ones tailor-made to shut us down. The neighborhood buzzed with anger. For weeks, we had stood together, laughing at her tantrums, brushing off her threats, but this was different. A bylaw change wouldn't just affect me, it would affect everyone. If passed, it would give Karen permanent power over the entire block. We had one chance, to stop the change before it passed. The first step was to rally the community again. I went door to door handing out flyers that explained the stakes. If this passes, I wrote, no one will be able to host birthday parties, cookouts, or gatherings without fear of fines. This isn't about one BBQ, it's about our right to enjoy our homes, neighbors responded with outrage. People who had stayed quiet until now suddenly found their voices. They were tired of Karen's reign of control, tired of living under constant surveillance. The block parties had reminded them what real community looked like, and they weren't about to lose that. We organized. The attorney neighbor drafted a petition, and within days nearly every household signed it. We scheduled meetings, shared talking points, and prepared to show up at the HOA board vote in force. Karen, of course, didn't sit idle. She doubled down, spreading fear wherever she could. She circulated letters about fire risks and property values, painting images of our neighborhood descending into chaos if BBQs were allowed to continue. She cornered newer families, warning them that their homes could lose value if loud parties weren't stopped. Her tactics were shameless, but they had an effect. Some people wavered, torn between their dislike of Karen and their fear of conflict. The day of the vote arrived like the climax of a storm. The community center was packed to bursting. Normally, HOA meetings drew a sleepy crowd of a dozen residents. Now, over 50 households showed up, filling the room with a nervous, electric energy. Karen sat near the front, her expression smug and self-satisfied. She had spent weeks preparing, and she believed this was her moment of triumph. But she hadn't counted on what came next. One by one, neighbors stood and spoke. They talked about how the BBQs had brought people together after years of isolation. Parents described how their kids had made new friends. Elderly residents shared how the gatherings made them feel less lonely. People who had never spoken at a meeting before poured out their frustrations with Karen's constant interference. When It was my turn. I stood tall and kept my voice steady. I explained that this wasn't about noise or smoke, it was about control. One person wanted to impose her will on an entire neighborhood, and if the board allowed it, they would destroy the very sense of community we had built. I reminded them that we had followed every law, secured permits when necessary, and never once caused harm. The only disruption came from Karen's endless complaints. Then came the attorney neighbor. Calm, precise, and professional, he dismantled Karen's arguments piece by piece. He explained that the proposed bylaws could be legally challenged, that they conflicted with city regulations, and that enforcing them would expose the HOA to lawsuits. He reminded the board that their duty was to represent the community, not the obsession of a single individual. By the time he finished, the room was buzzing with energy. People nodded, clapped, even cheered quietly. The tide had turned. Karen, sensing her grip slipping, rose for her rebuttal. She launched into a tirade about rowdy gatherings, disrespectful neighbors, and the decline of standards. Her voice rose higher and higher, trembling with anger, but instead of nods of agreement, she was met with sighs, eye rolls, and even laughter. Her words had lost their power. The board called the vote. One by one, members cast their ballots. And when the final count was read, the result was clear. The proposed bylaws were rejected. Overwhelmingly, the room erupted in applause. For the first time, the community had not only stood up to Karen, but beaten her at the very game she thought she owned. Karen's face told the whole story. Pale, trembling, her eyes darted around as though searching for an escape. She stormed out before the applause even died down, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. It felt like victory. We had protected our right to gather, to celebrate, to live without fear of her interference. But as the applause faded and the meeting ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Karen was humiliated, yes. She had lost her power, yes. But she wasn't the type to retreat quietly. People like her don't disappear. They brood, they plot, and they lash out when least expected, and I was right, because a week later, just as the neighborhood settled into its new rhythm of peace and unity, something happened that no one saw coming. A letter arrived from a law firm addressed, not just to me, but to several other households. Karen had filed a lawsuit against us, claiming harassment, emotional distress, and property devaluation. She was dragging the battle into the courts. The neighborhood had beaten her at the street level. We had beaten her at the HOA level. But now she was escalating to the highest level she could reach. The war wasn't over. In fact, it had just reached its most dangerous stage. The final showdown. The lawsuit hit like a thunderbolt. Thick envelopes from a downtown law firm arrived in several mailboxes, including mine. Inside were pages of legal jargon accusing us of harassment, emotional distress, and even deliberate property devaluation. Karen claimed that the BBQs, the block parties, and the neighborhood's campaign of hostility had ruined her life and lowered her home's value. She was demanding damages, tens of thousands of dollars from multiple families, myself included. It was Karen's most extreme escalation yet. She had failed with the police, failed with the HOA, and even failed with city inspectors. Now she was dragging the fight into the courts, hoping fear of lawyers and mounting legal bills would break us apart. For a moment, it worked. Some neighbors panicked. They whispered about settlements, about moving away, about how much it would cost to fight. The lawsuit was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a real threat to people's savings, their security, even their homes. But then something remarkable happened. The same community spirit that had carried us through the BBQs, the parties, and the HOA battle came alive once more. People refused to be intimidated. The attorney neighbor, who had already been our guide through the HOA mess, stepped forward again. He explained that the lawsuit was flimsy at best, built on exaggerations and baseless claims. He assured us that with a united front we could not only fight it but win. The neighborhood rallied. We pooled resources, set up a community legal fund, and prepared for court. What Karen had hoped would divide us only made us stronger. Families who had once barely spoken now stood shoulder to shoulder, determined not to let her win. The weeks leading up to the court date were tense. Karen strutted around the neighborhood as though victory was inevitable, her smug smile back in place. She made calls loudly on her porch, talking about her lawyer and how justice was finally on her side. She thought she had us cornered, but the truth was very different. Behind the scenes, our attorney neighbor had been preparing a case that would dismantle hers completely. He gathered evidence, collected witness statements, and organized videos of her tantrums, her false complaints, and her endless harassment. What Karen thought would be a clean strike against us was about to become her downfall. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was sterile and quiet, a sharp contrast to the months of noisy BBQs and block parties. Karen sat at one table, her lawyer beside her, her expression a mix of confidence and disdain. Across from her sat several of us, united, calm, and prepared. Karen's lawyer spoke first, painting a dramatic picture of a woman under siege. He described how Karen had been bullied, harassed, and tormented by her neighbors, how she had suffered sleepless nights and constant anxiety because of the raucous gatherings. He even claimed her property had lost value because of the hostile environment. For a moment, it sounded convincing. But then our turn came. Our attorney stood, calm and steady, and began to dismantle the claims one by one. He presented evidence of city permits for the block party, showing everything was legal and sanctioned. He pointed out that police reports from Karen's calls contained no violations. He showed inspection results proving the grill was compliant. He even played videos taken by multiple neighbors of Karen herself screaming, ranting, and harassing us. The courtroom chuckled as clips of her meltdowns played, her shrill accusations now exposed for what they were, baseless and absurd. The most powerful moment came when neighbor after neighbor took the stand. Parents described how the BBQs had given their kids joy. Elderly residents spoke about how the gatherings had eased their loneliness. Even families who had once stayed neutral admitted they were tired of Karen's constant interference. Every testimony painted the same picture. We were a community, and she was the problem. Karen's confidence crumbled. She fidgeted, glared, and whispered furiously to her lawyer. By the time it was her turn to testify, her composure was gone. She launched into another tirade, accusing everyone of conspiring against her, of creating a mob to torment her. But the more she spoke, the worse it sounded. Her bitterness, her obsession, her refusal to accept reality, it all came spilling out in front of the judge. When the hearing ended, the decision was swift. The judge dismissed her lawsuit entirely, calling it frivolous and without merit. Not only that, but Karen was ordered to pay our legal fees. The very weapon she had tried to use against us had turned back on her, leaving her financially crippled and publicly humiliated. The neighborhood erupted in celebration. That weekend, we held the biggest BBQ yet. Tables stretched across the street. Laughter echoed late into the night, and the smell of smoke and grilled food filled the air. This time, there was no fear, no hesitation, just joy. Karen, meanwhile, retreated. She stopped coming outside, stopped patrolling the block, stopped sending emails and letters. Her windows stayed dark, her lawn overgrown, her presence fading. Rumors spread that she was putting her house up for sale. Unable to face the neighborhood she had tried to control, and eventually she was gone. A for sale sign appeared in her yard, and a few months later, a moving truck carried her away. Just like that, the tyrant of the block was no more. Her life returned to peace, but better than before. The BBQs continued, sometimes small, sometimes huge. Birthdays, holidays, and random weekends all became excuses to gather, eat, and laugh. The community Karan had tried so hard to destroy had become stronger than ever. Dodd's eye stood at the grill. One evening, flipping burgers while kids played and neighbors chatted, I realized the irony. Karen had set out to end my BBQs. Instead, she had built them into something bigger, something lasting. She had united the neighborhood in a way nothing else could have. Her name was never spoken with anger anymore, only as a story, a cautionary tale, and a joke. The woman who called the cops on a BBQ had, in the end, cooked her own downfall, and with every sizzle of the grill, with every burst of laughter echoing down the street, we made sure her legacy was nothing more than smoke in the wind.